6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff.
Starship's 7th flight test launched on the afternoon of January 16, 2025. This flight debuted a new version of the Starship upper stage with hundreds of design improvements from the previous flight vehicles. Though, if you're watching this video, I assume you're already aware of most of the general changes, so for the sake of time, I'm going to skip past those. The suspected anomaly source is likely not a result of the redesigned components of the ship. This video contains some amount of speculation, as there is not much public information available. However, I have coordinated with multiple people to develop this timeline and ensure it is as sound as possible. Ascent was nominal, and the vehicle took a new, steeper trajectory to compensate for the heavier upper stage. The vehicle hot staging occurred 64 kilometers up and roughly 50 kilometers downrange from the launch site. The booster successfully returned to the launch tower around 3 minutes later. From here, the focus was on the Starship upper stage. Soon after the booster catch, multiple engines began to shut down, with telemetry eventually stopping at T+8 minutes and 26 seconds. Several minutes later, videos start pouring in of the breakup of Starship and the subsequent re-entry over the northern Caribbean islands. I have previously posted a video covering this entire sequence all synced up if you are interested. Following the flight, SpaceX published this note. The important part is this sentence here, stating that a fire developed in the aft section of Starship. Later on, Musk posted on Twitter saying that an oxygen and fuel leak had occurred in the engine bay cavity. Despite the wording of the tweet, it is unclear whether this was just a fuel leak or an oxygen leak or both. This is the most recent official information on the Starship failure that has been publicly released as of recording. For the purposes of this video, the assumption is that it was just a fuel leak, as that's what appears to be the most likely scenario. Also throughout this video, a compiled eyewitness account of the vehicle is featured on the top right corner. This account is sourced from the observation of 3 separate people who were watching the ship from the ground, some through binoculars, describing how the light from the engines looked as the Starship upper stage ascended. No public footage of the Starship upper stage after hot staging is available. As of recording, a FOIA request for tracking footage of the Starship upper stage is still pending. If that is approved, it will be posted in full on this channel as well as on other social media accounts. This video will cover the anomaly in a play-by-play, event-by-event style. The first of which is the fuel leak. Starship's engine section is laid out like this. This liquid oxygen tank sits up here. The liquid methane downcomer, coming from the liquid methane tank, which is situated above the oxygen tank, runs down the center like this and interfaces with the thrust puck and aft dome, which are these components here. From there, the Raptor engines are mounted to the dome, and then a firewall with a structural bracing is mounted just above the engines. This model is not the most accurate depiction of this area available, however, it should clearly illustrate the concept. The most likely place for this fuel leak to have started would be the methane transfer tube from that downcomer to the engine turbopumps, specifically on engine E1, which is the frontmost center engine right here. Here's an image of this transfer tube on the booster. There is not any photos available of these mounted to the Starship dome, however, the designs are remarkably similar as they serve the exact same purpose. This transfer tube, designed to flex and compensate for the engine gimbaling, has been observed before to be a very fragile component of the engine in past flights, including but not limited to both Flight 1 on Booster 7 as well as on Flight 2 with Ship 25, in addition to observed wreckage in the debris of the suborbital test campaign in 2020 and 2021. It is possible that a small tear formed or the interior liner was damaged from production and made it through quality control. The pressure inside these transfer tubes is about 11 bar, compared to the mildly lower pressure of the propellant tanks, which sits around 6 bar. A small tear or leakage would not immediately cause engine damage or failure due to the aforementioned pressure gradient. Such a leak would begin to become problematic as it grows in size. The transfer tube will exponentially lose more pressure as the surface area of the leak increases until the pressure is too low to support stable engine operation. When the inlet pressure for the engine drops below a critical level, cavitation bubbles may form, which has catastrophic effects to the rapidly rotating turbo machinery within the engine. Based off of eyewitness account from the ground, I am inclined to believe that this fuel leak started very early, right after T+5 minutes or so. On 2 of the 3 accounts, there was a note of a brief but noticeable pulsing in the ship's flare around this time, with a duration of only a few seconds. If you graph out the propellant consumption, like in this wonderful depiction by Launch Labs, there is a slight decrease in the flow rate at this same time. This is when I believe the fuel leak began. About 2 minutes go by where the leak develops and the propellant that is leaking remains unignited within the cavity. The state of the vehicle is volatile up until the shutdown of the first engine, which occurs at T+7 minutes and 39 seconds. This engine shutdown was likely a very violent failure, caused by cavitation bubbles from reduced inlet pressure as mentioned previously. All 3 ground observations reported the same phenomenon, with the flare becoming gradually brighter over the span of several seconds before a quick flash. Only one of the accounts described the color of the flare to have changed to orange during said flash, so it is notable to point out that this is the only time in which the flare of the ship was reported to have visibly changed color throughout this entire sequence. An engine failure via cavitation in the inducer would have likely blown out the housing of the engine. Most of the shockwave would not reflect back upwards, but rather laterally outwards and then down, so there is a very low chance the engine failure actually caused much damage upstream of the transfer tube. Previously, I had seen mentions of this cloud being the debris left behind from this engine failure. However, this cloud is actually the residuals left behind from hot staging. Funnily enough, is actually visible on GOES imagery for one frame right about here, so that's kind of cool. Additional evidence supporting the violent engine shutdown includes the increased fuel consumption immediately after E1 cuts off from the stream graphic. The energetic failure of the E1 engine would have been the primary ignition source for the fire. As previously mentioned, fuel consumption drastically increased following cutoff, which likely means that the transfer tube was not fully closed off from the fuel downcomer at E1 shutdown, and instead was leaking excessive amounts of fuel for several seconds. The energetic failure of E1 would have also briefly opened up an oxygen leak from the engine itself, before the oxygen supply valve from the tank closed off, supplying just enough oxidizer into the engine bay cavity to sustain the engine bay fire. Shortly after the flight, Musk posted on Twitter citing that the fire built pressure in excess of the engine bay vents. It is reasonable to assume the vents were designed to handle a moderate propellant leak and the associated pressure buildup from a liquid propellant turning into a gas. However, the previously mentioned extensive buildup of leaking fuel was the perfect storm to almost immediately overpressurize the engine bay cavity. About 15 seconds after E1 shut down, we get this view from the ship of the MY aft flap. If you look at the main flap hinge here, you can see fire within the vehicle coming out of this hinge. The reason that this fire is visible is because the flap hinge and motors are situated within the engine bay cavity, as you can see in this photo of Ship 25. The fact that the fire is already visible on the opposite side of the vehicle from the potential ignition source within less than 15 seconds shows how much propellant had already accumulated within the cavity volume. The rapid and violent formation of the engine bay cavity fires likely burned through several unprotected components of engines and other engine bay subsystems. From the ground observations, 2 of the 3 accounts described a very slight intermittent flickering for about 20 to 30 seconds following the flash. For engine combustion to be fluctuating so much that it is visible from hundreds of kilometers away, said engine would have to be slowly falling out of sync with itself, as most engines must be constantly adjusting the flow rate of several valves to maintain stable combustion. It is likely that the fires destroyed critical connections on the engines themselves, while the individual engine controllers remained intact. If some specific connections are severed, the engines may be unable to control critical systems to maintain stable combustion, and they would rapidly destabilize, forming large fluctuations in thrust and major combustion instability. If the engine controllers still have access to the main fuel and main oxidizer valves, it would command a shutdown of the engine once combustion instability began. The assumption is that the remaining 5 engines all succumb to similar issues induced by that fire. I have seen some point out that the engines appear to shut down in a roughly clockwise orientation. However, I do not think that this is related to the manner in which the engines failed. LOS, or loss of signal, occurred at T plus 8 minutes and 26 seconds. It is not entirely clear what caused LOS. However, I have gone through several theories, and the following seems to be a consensus for the most likely scenario. Starship has at least one known battery location, and that is located within the engine bay cavity as seen here. It is speculated that there may be another battery in the payload section as well, but there has been no evidence for this as of late. It is likely that the fire either completely disabled the battery or toasted the high voltage connections to said battery to induce a full vehicle power loss. This means that both the forward and aft flight computers would simultaneously be shut down along with the last remaining engine. This is notable for one very specific reason. Way back in 2023, Starship S-25 experienced a similar engine bay fire and subsequent failure. The vehicle was blown up by the flight termination system at the end of the ascent burn. The reason for the FTS detonating on that flight was because the communication lines between the forward and aft flight computers was disrupted, meaning that the computers could not communicate with each other while both computers were still online. In the case of Starship 33, both flight computers are shut down simultaneously while the communication channels remained intact. This is why Starship 33 was not blown up by the FTS upon LOS. It should be noted that the FTS has its own redundant batteries, computers, antennas, inertial measurement units, among other things, so it is unaffected by the power loss and still knows the trajectory of the ship. Following LOS and the associated power loss, the vehicle was tumbling due to the force induced by the engine shutdowns and the final cutoff. Starship almost immediately began venting from the aft section upon the start of this unpowered coast. It is undeterminable if this venting was commanded by the FTS or as a result from damage of the last engine shutdown. Many people believed that the vehicle blew up immediately after loss of signal, which is untrue. Starship launched at exactly 16:37 in local time on the dot, or exactly 22:37 UTC. Multiple photos of the subsequent breakup of the vehicle are timestamped at 22:48:23 UTC. This means that the vehicle broke up around T plus 11 minutes and 22 seconds, which is just under 3 minutes from the time of LOS at T plus 8 minutes and 26 seconds. This conclusion is further supported by some quick math in which we can determine the exact position of each event and then figure out where the vehicle exploded based off the location of several videos. This part, frankly, drove me insane, but I managed to locate about half a dozen camera angles and find the location of the breakup to a 44 square kilometer area. That sounds like a lot of area, but it's actually relatively small and is more than enough to determine the trajectory of the Starship from that point. Closer to the breakup, people start filming the ship from the ground. You can see the venting plume pulsing. Even at times, it appears as though it is lopsided. That is because the vehicle was tumbling laterally. The plume is more visible when the vehicle is facing prograde to its trajectory, and less visible when the vehicle is facing retrograde to its trajectory. The flight termination system terminates the flight at T plus 11 minutes and 22 seconds.
Whoa! What? Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh!
For a while, it has been constantly debated on what initiated the final breakup. Based off of all available evidence, I am confident in saying that the flight termination system was what initiated the breakup. The previously mentioned video triangulation led me to find the rough geographic location of the breakup along the ground track, located at 22 degrees, 40 minutes, 6.39 seconds north, 76 degrees, 50 minutes, 24.42 seconds west. Plotting this location along with all published hazard zones reveals something interesting. The breakup occurs between the boundaries of two airspace zones. The green shape here represents the zone established by the Marine Safety Information Bulletin, or MISB notice. The pink shape represents the Notice to Air Missions Notices, or NOTAMs, established through the Cadena OIS. The NOTAMs are in the Miami and San Juan airspaces. It is not clear which one of these notices marked the actual boundary of the flight corridor, as they are fairly evenly spaced, but I am confident in saying it was the additional NOTAMs that marked the edge of the corridor. Vehicle breakup occurred somewhere around 75 to 76 kilometers in altitude, slightly lower than my initial estimate of 84 kilometers. The fact that the vehicle was that low in the atmosphere suggests that the NOTAM boundary applied to the actual flight corridor, as that altitude is not technically classified as outer space. Many people wonder why the FTS did not terminate the flight during the coast phase. The simple truth is that it did not have to. The FTS is not actually required to terminate the vehicle until it leaves the established flight corridor, even if it knows that the vehicle trajectory ends outside of the corridor. Additionally, initiating a breakup earlier into the flight would only spread debris further than they already did. It will always terminate at the last possible moment. Some people ask why they didn't just keep the vehicle intact the whole way down. Ignoring the fact that the termination system is required by law to detonate the moment the vehicle has left the approved flight corridor, the risk of a fully intact ship coming down on a populated island is far worse than the risk of small debris being dispersed over several islands and the ocean. Entry interface for the debris cloud began around 2249 UTC. The orientation in which the breakup occurred caused the nose and aft sections of the ship to survive relatively intact to later breakup. You can see the two respective trails for each section, and later on it will be easier to identify. In this video, you can distinctly see the two globules of debris. The much more orange, tighter streak is the nose cone section. The bright white and green streak, which is spread out further, is the aft section globule. This is identifiable because of the materials featured in each section. Based off of previous flights, we know that the nose cone section is much more resilient to breakup, so it stays roughly intact until the very end. The aft section features the engines, which are made of exotic special alloys. These alloys, most being derivatives of Inconel, burn bright white and blue. The green sections are part of tank barrel sections with lots of tiles still attached, the green color itself coming from the borosilicate glass coating on the tiles. The rest of the debris between the two globules is the remainder of the ship, mostly propellant tank components. Importantly, these two globules of debris took very different trajectories on re-entry. In these very special photos directly downrange, you can see this effect very easily. The camera perspective is looking almost directly down the nose cone globule. However, you can see the aft section globule arcing over to the left side of the frame. The reason why it does this arc mid-entry is not entirely clear, most likely due to velocity imparted by the explosion itself. There are several photos from this perspective showing as it moves. Beyond this point, there is not much video footage. The sonic booms of the debris was picked up by a seismometer in the Turks and Caicos Islands. Here, you can distinctly see the two booms caused by each of the two globules entering the atmosphere. The nose cone globule would fall short and impact the ocean first. Consisting of lighter components, it gets slowed down by the atmosphere much quicker. The aft section globule continues to arc over to the south, eventually being picked up by a Doppler radar in San Juan, Puerto Rico. This radar track is extremely concerning. Despite what many people insist for some odd reason, the debris did in fact exit the established hazard zone. This radar streak is not an anomaly. Each data point has a respective altitude reading seen here, and it is not actually adjacent with the center of the radar. The debris of the aft section is much denser, so it travels further than the nose cone section before impacting the ocean only 40 kilometers northwest of Puerto Rico's coastline. Here's a map showing the hazard zones in green and pink as previously mentioned, with the trajectory in red and the estimated debris coverage in yellow. The FAA activated an air disaster response plan, which always happens if debris were to exit the hazard zone. They also later directly stated that the debris did in fact exit the hazard zone. SpaceX put up a notice on their website stating that all debris did land in the hazard zone. This segment of the notice was removed only minutes after publication and reworded to would have fallen in the hazard zone. A mishap investigation is currently underway. Hundreds, if not thousands, of fragments of Starship rained down over the northern Caribbean. Particularly notable is the Turks and Caicos Islands, which seems to take the brunt of the lighter debris. A highlight of the recovered debris includes a stringer fragment,
Piece of SpaceX.
hundreds of fragments of the ablative underlayer of the heat shield,
Another piece washed up.
thousands of thermal protection tiles, large barrel section fragments,
It's a Elon Musk ship, man. Radio. See you. Elon Musk. must come for it. It's a big piece. It's a big piece here. You almost sit on under it. You see that?
Another stringer fragment.
One of the tanks. See ya. Landed in my yacht.
And most notably, a fragment of an RVAC bell extension hitting a car.
El diablo está muriendo.
El tigre está muriendo.
This last piece is particularly interesting, but it can be verified. Here, you can see the individual regen channels within the section. Also, spanning the length of the piece, you can find several indentations that line up with the spacing and thickness of structural components of the bell that runs in between the regen channels. SpaceX got some good data from this flight of a new generation of Starship, but it also fell drastically shorter than intended, caused damage to public property, spread debris outside of the hazard zone, caused major air traffic disruptions, and allegedly an ablative sheet even hit a person. You cannot look at events like this through rose-tinted glasses, and there are some serious problems that occurred during this flight. All in all, this seems like sort of a fluke of a failure. The design of the ship is fine and works for the most part. Quality control has been a large problem in the past with Starship, and it is not surprising that an issue like this would crop up at some point.